Welcome back to the class, and we are towards the end of the discussion on Emile Durkheim. So, in today's class, we will have a critical evaluation or an assessment of Emile Durkheim as a classical sociologist. I think we spent some close to 6 to 7 sessions discussing various aspects of Emile Durkheim, and we try to discuss why that Emile Durkheim is considered to be one of the most important classical thinkers of sociology. So we spent time trying to understand his intellectual context and his basic arguments about the exclusivity of sociology as a discipline and the phenomenal role that he played in laying out the methodological and epistemological basis for this new discipline. His preoccupation with objectivity and positivism, and his magnum opus, that is division of labor, which was basically his PhD work, in which he brought in this peculiarity of the social as he understood in a very forceful manner. And we had 2 sessions indeed discussing this division of labor. Then we also discussed his work on suicide, considered to be an extremely important work, which very beautifully elaborated how this rules of sociological method can be put into practice. Actually, that was one of his major intentions, to demonstrate how the methodological protocol that he elaborated can be put into use to analyze a particular social phenomenon. And another very important aspect regarding this whole discussion on suicide, as we discussed in the previous class, is also because he was able to very successfully demonstrate that a sociological method is something so important to understand suicide as a social phenomenon, and that the distinction between suicide as an individual phenomenon and suicide rate as a social phenomenon is something so striking, it is so stark. And he was very successfully able to show that you cannot use a psychological perspective or a perspective from psychology or any other discipline to understand that why that there are certain predispositions among populations running into thousands of or hundreds of thousands of people, into why that certain number of people are destined to commit suicide, and why that there is the suicide rates continue to be constant across populations or across the times or in comparison with other population. So we also discussed his very important work on elementary forms of religious life, which is considered to be one of the most important and classic works for anybody who is interested in sociology of religion. We also had another session in which we looked into Durkheim's ideas, Durkheim's approach, Durkheim's position regarding morality, education, democracy, and colonialism. So we are coming to the fag end of the discussion on Emile Durkheim, and today it is an assessment. So Emile Durkheim is, along with Karl Marx and Max Weber, one of the holy trinity of sociology's early masters. I don't think that I need to elaborate this point further, because in this course as well we will be spending maximum time to discuss these 3 important scholars: Karl Marx, Emile Durkheim, and Max Weber, because they are known as the holy trinity. They are known as the most influential thinkers, or the classical thinkers, the stalwarts, the early masters, the founding fathers of the discipline. And especially, unlike Marx, who was not a sociologist per se, Durkheim is credited with establishing the discipline through his professional activities and also through his intellectual contributions of laying down the foundation, charting out a methodological protocol, very vociferously arguing that sociology is indeed a distinct discipline. It cannot be conflated with other disciplines. So this is a discipline which wants to explore certain very definitive phenomenon, very exclusive phenomenon of what is under what he calls it as the social. Okay? So in that sense, definitely, undoubtedly, Durkheim belongs to this one among this holy trinity. In the division of labor, some of the key mechanisms by which complex systems sustain integration, structural interdependence, abstract and general values and beliefs, more specific beliefs and norms to regulate relations within and between differentiated groups and organizations, and networks of subgroups forming larger coalitions and confederations with common interests. Each of these aspects have become so predominant in the latter sociological discourses and theories, especially for the theoretical tradition known as structural functionalism, which we will discuss towards the end of the course. These, especially some of these most important themes that are discussed in his work, this division of labor assumes great significance because he discusses some of the key mechanisms by which complex systems sustain integration. So we discussed that in the previous class. Durkheim was really preoccupied with the whole question of social integration. What holds the society together? What are the mechanisms through which an individual feels connected and loyal and bound with the society in which he or she lives? So that was his perennial, preoccupation. That was his throughout his the kind of academic or intellectual concern that came struggled with. So in this particular work, in trying to understand these set of mechanisms by which complex systems sustain integration, he speaks about a series of important issues: structural interdependence, how and why that there are different substructures or subsystems within a social system are interconnected, or in a what way. For example, this economic subsystem of a society is very closely connected with the political subsystem, or a kinship system is connected with the political subsystem. So this kind of a structural explanation is something very important element that Durkheim had preoccupation with. And then this role of abstract and general values and beliefs, another very, very important aspect, the kind of a part of this non-material culture, which includes your morals, beliefs, cultural systems and religion. And we discussed that why Durkheim was so preoccupied with this whole question of religion, because it is not only that he was interested in understanding how and why religion functions, but this was also a part of his larger interest in this whole question of general values and beliefs, because these general values and beliefs have very specific concrete consequences on the social structure. Okay? So when we talk about this distinction between material and non-material aspect of culture, they are not completely separate realms. They are extremely interconnected. They are extremely interlinked and influences each other. And the more specific beliefs and norms to regulate relations within and between differentiated groups and organizations. So we discussed that how he is explaining that how this kind of specific beliefs give certain sense of solidarity, certain sense of we feeling, certain sense of integration to different societies. He in his study on suicide, he very elaborately argues that Protestants have more tendency to commit suicide in comparison with Catholics, because the theology of Protestantism allows a room for more individualism in comparison with that of Catholicism, which emphasize more on tradition, which emphasize more on a kind of a community feeling, and a host of networks of subgroups forming larger coalitions and confederations with common aims. So this whole focus with the structural relationship with how smaller groups come together, how smaller systems contribute for the existence of a larger social system was one of the major theoretical preoccupations of Emile Durkheim. And moreover, his analysis of the pathologies such as anomie that arise from the failure to achieve integration are some of the sociology's most enduring concepts. And we discussed that, I think, several times, that he uses this term normal and pathological. Okay? A term, a kind of an approach which most of the sociologists do not do that. For example, Max Weber, who came immediately after Emile Durkheim, is not fond of using this term pathology, because it preoccupies, it presupposes an assumption that certain kind of social systems are more desirable than the other one. And Weber takes a completely different position. And a host of sociologists now, they don't use the term pathological, because it smarts of a kind of a comparison with human body, with a living organism, and social science with a modern medicine. So his analysis of the pathologies such as anomie, but you know that this whole idea about anomie is something very, very important. Okay? The significance that a society needs to have specific set of values, needs to have specific set of values, and in the absence of these values, society will not work. And that arises from the failure to achieve integration and some of the sociology's most enduring concepts. So this whole concept of anomie, the argument that every society needs to have a stipulated set of norms and values that regulate people's aspirations and their activities. It's an extremely important topic, extremely important one. And it's not about this complete lack of norms, because there's no society where there's complete lack of norms, but the kind of a social understanding that these norms have to be rather well defined. You need to have a set of well defined norms is an extremely important topic, and its connection with the whole question of integration. They have been some of the sociology's most enduring concepts. And in his analysis of suicide, as we just discussed, emphasizing this individual's integration into social structures and cultures have been widely used in sociological studies of deviance, crime, and other social pathologies. Because we discussed that, we saw that how foundational was his work on suicide, because in a very innovative argument, in a very provocative argument, he could demonstrate, or he rather successfully demonstrated that why a large number of people tend to commit suicide. It has very specific connection with the degree of integration that these people experience and the extent of control that they experience in a given society. And that has led to, that really laid foundation to a host of sociological theories and discussions on the questions of deviance, on crime, on law, and a host of other social pathologies, especially on delinquency, on deviance, on crime, and why that certain actions are defined as crime, and why that there are higher degree of crime, proclivity to commit crime among certain groups, especially in the context of race discrimination in US and Europe. These discussions have been very, very important. And perhaps most significant is Durkheim's recognition in his last major work, Elementary Forms of Religious Life, that rituals directed at symbolic representations of group constitutes the basis of integration at the micro level of social organization. And we discussed that, an extremely important argument, the kind of a very close connection between the symbolic system and its enactment, its performance as a kind of a ritual, and how that contributes for an enhanced sense of integration between for an individual with that of the society. Okay. So we discussed that for Durkheim, religion is nothing but society worshipping itself. Okay. It is nothing but a community worshipping itself. And he argues that these rituals are so important because they reinforce, they reiterate, or they cement the kind of attachment and the belongingness that an individual feels towards his own community. Okay. So that is a kind of a beautiful sociological explanation that Durkheim provides to the wide forms of religiosity, including that of belief systems, including rituals, customs, festivities, congregations, and a host of other things. And each of these arguments really laid foundation for novel forms of explanation for the sociologists who came after Durkheim, who were interested in understanding different forms of society. And his insistence on analyzing one of the social facts by another, Durkheim made a very strong case for a sociology as a distinct kind of enterprise. And here we come across this point specifically is his enormous contribution in terms of methodology and theory. Okay? Because that if a discipline has to take shape, if a discipline needs to establish itself, and then if that has to be done, then it requires its founding fathers to very clearly delineate the kind of an exclusive methodological as well as epistemological foundation for the discipline. A discipline assumes its credentials only when its practitioners are able to tell explicitly that this discipline is unique in terms of its epistemology, in terms of its methodology. In what way it is different from other disciplines, and what are the kind of a theoretical possibilities? What are its unique possibilities offered by this particular discipline? And Durkheim succeeded to a large extent in doing that. So in that sense, Durkheim very forcefully argued to see sociology as a positive science. And we discussed it sufficiently because he was of the opinion that sociology can be seen as a science that looks at the social phenomenon just like any other physical science that looks at the nature or physical phenomena of the world. So Durkheim was a positivist, and he used this positivist methodology when he studied suicide or when he studied other phenomena, because he believed that one set of social facts can be analyzed by another set of social facts by using all possibilities offered by science. Now, what are the kind of a critical evaluations? Now, we discussed so far about the enormous contributions offered by Durkheim, But then, what are the kind of a criticisms being leveled against Durkheim by other sociologists, or how do we evaluate Durkheim as a scholar now when we look back almost 100 years back, or more than 100 years back? So, Durkheim has been accused as a social conservative, someone preoccupied with the questions of integration by ignoring constraints and coercion behind it. Durkheim does not investigate the extent to which shared culture upheld and reinforced values of a ruling class. And if you just keep Karl Marx in mind, this particular point of criticism becomes more evident. Durkheim was a kind of a social conservative. His entire articulation of sociology as a discipline was aimed to understand this whole question of social integration. Okay? And he was not a person who celebrated social change. He was very skeptical about social change, especially the more dramatic or drastic form of social change, something like a revolution. Durkheim was extremely skeptical of that. Durkheim was extremely doubtful about the positive aspects of these revolution. He did not even believe in the kind of an emancipatory revolution, emancipatory possibilities of revolution as did as in the case of Karl Marx. So he has been accused as a social conservative who was always preoccupied with the question of identifying the conditions that will ensure the continuation of a social status quo or a social order or a social stability, and someone preoccupied with the question of integration by ignoring constraints and coercion behind it. You know that the whole question of integration is a very, very problematic one. Of course, Durkheim presented it as a very positive one, but we also need to keep in mind that integration can be achieved through a whole set of coercive mechanisms. Okay, for example, a slave society. A society in which slavery is being institutionalized will have a set of will have its own set of integration, or a feudal society which will have its own quality of integration. But what extent can we celebrate that kind of integration is a very problematic question. To what extent you can say that this is a very, very, very acceptable form of integration is a very, very problematic statement. So Durkheim did not really pay sufficient attention to the kind of constraints and coercion behind it. He did not really look into. Durkheim does not investigate the extent to which shared culture upheld and reinforced the values of a ruling class. Okay, so who is holding power in a society, and how is this power gets translated into both material aspect as well as non-material aspects of power relation? How this power relation gets translated into different modes of cultural symbols, shared cultural values, and how that a large section of population are directly or indirectly forced to believe in this particular cultural value is a very important question that Durkheim did not ask. Okay, so he did not pay sufficient attention to the role played by shared culture and how it was reinforced by the values of a ruling class, values which were enforced on others, which were imposed on others by the sheer power of the ruling class. And here, Marx comes as a complete stark contrast. Marx very emphatically argues that the dominant values of every society are the values of the dominant class. A very extremely incisive argument. the dominant values of every society are the values of the dominant class. Whereas Durkheim does not look into the whole question of who is dominant and why certain other people are not dominant, and whether is there any connection between this the set of values upheld by the dominant class over others. He doesn't really look into that. Durkheim does not see people as skilled, reflexive persons who knowledgeably and actively create the world in which they live. And this is yet another very, very interesting point of debate. Durkheim is extremely skeptical about the whole question of people's autonomy, and he believes that people behave in a kind of a mechanical manner because they are completely constrained by social facts. Okay, a person is born into a world of social facts, and he or she is socialized into that, and then she acts as per the diktats of the society. You remember the discussion we had about social fact. Durkheim very beautifully argues that social facts are coercive. The moment you try to deviate from a social fact, society will pounce upon you. Society will act aggressively on you. Society will teach you a lesson. So in that sense, we get a very pessimistic view about the possibility of an individual. Durkheim is very clear that society is like a cage, and once you are into that cage, you can't really move out of that. And this position has been criticized by a whole lot of other people. They have argued that Durkheim has a very, very negative image about the autonomy or freedom of individual. So Durkheim does not see people as skilled, reflexive persons who knowledgeably and actively create the world in which they live. The extent to which human beings are capable of creating a life for themselves, a society for themselves, is very little according to Durkheim. So this point has come up again and again as a major point of criticism. For Durkheim, people are rule-following creatures. He does not see them as rule-creating creatures. A very important argument. So Durkheim really downplays the role of human agency. Durkheim really, does not provide or does not give sufficient attention to the ability of human beings to actively create a society. And he ignores the role of power as something that we discussed here. The question of unequal situation of a society, unequal structuring of a society, who holds power, who does not hold power, and how this inequality in power is shaping a society in a particular manner has not been the major focus of Durkheim. So Jennifer Lehman contends that Durkheim's reflections on women in suicide are indicative of a patriarchal viewpoint which characterizes Durkheim's entire social theory. Of course, we know that we discussed that. So he was not really able to move beyond the kind of a patriarchal sentiments or patriarchal ideology that was reigning during his particular time. So he shared quite a lot of such patriarchal viewpoints which characterized Durkheim's entire social theory. Then a rational public man is implicitly contracted with passive emotional woman. There is a gender division as public, social, rational life represents male, and private sphere of the family, which is passionate, irrational and biological, represents the female. Durkheim sees this division as beneficial, universal and moral. Even in reality, it reflects the patriarchal power of men over women. So this the kind of characterization that we are making this point, it is typical of the kind of a binary that are presented by social theorists, also presented in the commonsensical realm of every society, where you look at public man, rational public man is implicitly contrasted with passive and emotional woman. Rationality, the ability to think scientifically, the ability to detach from emotion is seen as a unique ability of the man, whereas woman is seen as passive and is seen as emotional, is seen as vulnerable. And this gender division as a public man, as a social man, and a rational life of human beings, rational life of man is contrasted with the private sphere of woman, that of the family, and which is passionate, irrational and biological, represents the female. And this is an extremely important argument. If you are familiar with the theories of feminism, these contrasts are brought into the fore and they are critiqued very, very systematically. The conventional way in which men are associated with the public sphere
and the women are associated with the private sphere. Men are associated with the public society, whereas the women are associated with the private domestic sphere. And the men are rational, scientific, courageous, not emotional, whereas women are more passionate, they are emotional, they are illogical, they are irrational. And this particular depiction of men and women as binaries, okay, this was something very predominant during Durkheim's time, and Durkheim did not question that, rather he went by that, and he even argued that this was something beneficial. It was something beneficial because the domestic sphere is taken care by more appropriate women because they are more emotional, and the private and the public sphere is taken care by men who are scientifically oriented, who are rationally oriented. And he argued that it is universal, and not only that, it is moral. It is something desirable. It is how society must work. And it's a very problematic position. Now, no sociologists would agree with that. We all know that how gender roles are defined, how gender roles are reinforced. There is nothing natural that a woman takes care of the household and man goes out work. And we have n number of examples, a whole lot of societies where these gender roles or gender gender division of labor is completely dismantled. Okay, but Durkheim believed that, and where in reality it reflects the patriarchal power of men over women. So Durkheim believed also another set of criticism. Durkheim also believed that racial problems like class issues would be solved by the increased rational division of labor, where people naturally reach their ability level. He does not analyze the power of racism and issues of privilege associated with that. And this is again a point we came across when we discussed his argument about or his viewpoints on education and on morality. Durkheim is rather naive in believing that the people will be able to overcome all these issues of racism and other things. They are able to think rationally, but we know that those things do not happen. Especially the people who occupy positions of privilege, it will be very hard for them to let that go. It never happens automatically. And we have been seeing over this so many decades that the people who always have these privileges, they try to safeguard that. They try to lay a monopolistic claim over that. And hence this distinction within society, it continues. The discrimination within the society continues. But Durkheim believed that when people becoming more and more rational, these privileges will come down. The kind of ascribed status, your higher status, your wealth, and your higher ritual position, all these things will come down. But that did not happen. So he does not analyze the power of racism and issues of privilege associated with that. Race was not a major concern for Durkheim. He did not look at race as a socially constructed one, and a construct that has enormous significance, enormous implication, consequence on the everyday lives of people. On the one hand, when it privileges a certain group of people, because of that very privilege, it has enormous negative consequences on the vast majority of the rest of the people. He did not really bother to look into that. He often argued that the need for social integration brought about the cultural and structural arrangement that the world meet this need for integration, a problem of teleology. So he often argued that the need for social integration brought about the cultural and structural arrangement that would meet this need for integration. So another major point of criticism about Durkheim is that his theories on, especially on structural functionalism, is nothing but a kind of a teleological argument, because he thinks that he argues, see, teleology, you understand that you believe that certain things are in place because of its intended functions. So you make a kind of a confusion between the causality and its functionality. So Durkheim was not free from that. So he believed that argued that the need for social integration brought about the cultural and structural arrangement that would meet this need for integration. So this integration was seen as an ultimate a requirement, and for achieving that requirement, he believed that societies went into different forms of differentiation and different forms of structural arrangement, and that led to an inescapable situation of teleology. So this has been widely pointed out by a host of people who were extremely critical of Durkheim's position on structural functionalism. Okay, so we need to end here. Now, let me reiterate the point that Durkheim definitely is one of the most important scholars of sociology, who provided a kind of very distinctive character, who played one of the most important role in establishing sociology as a distinct discipline, as a distinct modern discipline with a unique, exclusive epistemological methodological orientation, which studies a unique phenomenon in the society, the social in the society. So you will see that how these arguments are criticized by later scholars. When Max Weber comes into picture, he criticizes his positivistic orientation. He provides a very beautiful counter argument against the kind of a positivistic orientation of Durkheim's argument. So these discussions continue. Okay, so let us end here, and we will meet in the next class for our discussion on Max Weber. Thank you.